She had 17 pages left to write before whatever found her on that trail made certain she would not write them. My name is Robert Bowman. 26 years guiding the Bitterroot Range, 4 years in the Marines before that. I do not reach conclusions quickly or carelessly. The notebook was found near the Magruder Corridor trailhead on September 24, 2019. The woman who wrote it was found the same morning, alive, walking out under her own power, left arm fractured, boots worn through on the inner sole from 3 days of moving carefully across ground she could not always see. Her name was Margaret Ellison. She was 41 years old, a wildlife biologist, a 16-year veteran of solo backcountry research work. She was not a woman given to confusion or invention. The 17 pages she wrote during those 3 days in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness are the most precise field observations of a Dogman encounter I have ever read, and I have been sitting on them for 5 years. What happened to Margaret Ellison on that trail is the story I am here to tell. Not because I was there, I was not, but because someone read those notes and believed them, and that someone gave them to me, and I have spent 5 years understanding what she saw well enough to do it justice. None of my years in that wilderness prepared me for what was in her handwriting. What I haven't told you yet is that my property in Ravalli County backs up against national forest land that connects through a series of drainages to the very wilderness section where Margaret Ellison had her encounter. The same water moves past both places. I have walked that connection many times without knowing what it meant. 3 people know I have these notes. My former guiding partner Dale Ostrowski, who spent 15 years working the Selway drainage alongside me, and who, when I showed him the photocopies, read them twice without speaking, and then said only, "I always thought that section of trail was wrong." My daughter Cassidy, who lives in Missoula, and who asked me, calmly and without judgment, why I had been sitting on this for 5 years, and a retired Fish and Wildlife officer named Harlan Pope, who was on the search team that found Margaret Ellison, and who photocopied the notebook before returning it to her because, in his words, some things need to exist somewhere that isn't an official record. Harlan gave me those photocopies in November of 2019. He is the reason this story exists in any form at all. Why am I telling this now? I had a cardiac event in February of 2024, a warning, treatable, procedure done in April, prognosis good. But in the window between the diagnosis and the all clear, I looked at what I had been carrying and made a decision. Margaret Ellison survived something on that trail that official accounts will never touch. She wrote down what she experienced with the precision of a scientist who knew her observations might matter. That record deserves to exist somewhere public. She has her own reasons for staying quiet. I have not asked her to speak, and I will not name the university she works for, but somebody ought to say plainly what she found. I am not asking you to believe me. I am telling you what is in those 17 pages. Before I go further, if you have been on this channel before, you know I do not rush these. If you are new, this is where I tell stories from 40 years in the Montana backcountry, some explainable, some not. All of them true to the best of my knowledge and recollection. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means these stories reach people who are looking for them. Now, let me take you back to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, September 2019, and to what Margaret Ellison found on a trail she had every reason to believe was ordinary. To understand what happened to Margaret Ellison, you have to understand the country she was in. The Magruder Corridor is not casual wilderness. It runs east to west through the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, one of the largest roadless areas in the continental United States, roughly 1.3 million acres of terrain that has not been meaningfully altered by human activity in most of its extent. The Magruder Road, which forms the southern boundary of the wilderness on one side, is a single-lane dirt track, passable only a few months a year, and requiring a vehicle with genuine clearance and a driver who knows what they are doing. Most of the trail system branching north off the corridor sees hunters in October and almost no one else. Cell service ends about 40 minutes before you reach the trailhead. The drainage Margaret was surveying, I will call it the North Fork drainage to avoid identifying her research site specifically, runs down from the high country into a series of lodgepole and western larch benches before opening into a broader valley where the ungulate movement patterns she was studying would concentrate. She had done a preliminary survey of this area 2 years prior. She knew it. She had GPS waypoints, a satellite communicator, a bear canister, and enough food for 7 days on a planned 5-day solo. She had emergency contacts with her department, who were instructed to call search and rescue if she missed her check-in by more than 12 hours. She missed her first check-in on September 21st. Search and rescue was notified the morning of September 22nd. She walked out on her own on the morning of September 24th. The 3 days in between are what the 17 pages describe. I want to tell you something about my own relationship with that drainage before I get into the notebook, because it is relevant. I guided that country from 1994 through 2011. I know it the way you know the house you grew up in. Not perfectly, not encyclopedically, but in the specific way of a body that has moved through a place so many times that the terrain is part of your physical memory. I know where the creek crossings are safe in high water and where they are not. I know which benches hold elk in early fall and which ones the elk avoid, and some of those avoidances are seasonal, and some of them are permanent, built into the herd's knowledge across generations in a way that tells you something made a decision about that piece of ground long before any current animal was born. I know the particular acoustic quality of that lodgepole country at night, the way sound carries differently between the trees than it does in open terrain, the way the creek noise can mask your own footsteps or amplify something else entirely, depending on where you are standing relative to the water. I know that section of trail. My guiding partner for most of those years was Dale Ostrowski, 15 years working that same drainage alongside me, a man who does not say things he has not arrived at through direct experience. When I eventually showed him the photocopy of Margaret's notebook that winter after Harlan Pope gave it to me, he read it through twice without speaking, set it on my kitchen table, looked at the window for a while, then he said, "I always thought that section of trail was wrong." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Wrong in the way a room can be wrong. The animals move through that stretch too quickly, like they made a decision a long time ago about what was in it, and whatever made them make it is still there." He poured himself another whiskey and did not say anything else about it. Dale is a man of calibrated silences, and that was a large one. I remember my father, a plumber from Billings, not a man given to extended reflection, once looking up from a job he was doing under a sink and saying that the most dangerous thing a person can do is decide they understand something before they have finished learning it. He was talking about pipes at the time. He was right about most other things, too. I thought I understood that drainage. I thought I understood what lived in it. Margaret Ellison's 17 pages told me otherwise. She arrived at the trailhead on September 18th, a Wednesday, at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Her entry in the notebook for that day is standard research notation: weather conditions, temperature, trail conditions, initial wildlife sign observed, time of camp establishment. She was professional and methodical from the first entry. Her handwriting is small and clear, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of field notebooks where space is finite and precision is required. The first 2 days are unremarkable. She made her way up the drainage, established a base camp at a location she describes precisely, conducted her morning and evening observation transects, and noted the ungulate sign she was looking for. The weather was cold and clear. The larches were beginning to turn. She writes about the color of the light at evening in a way that is not scientific and is clearly just a person who loves the country she works in. A brief, unguarded sentence about the gold of the larch needles against the dark timber that she probably would have edited out of a formal report. It is the most personal moment in the first 8 pages. I have read it many times. The third day, September 20th, is where the notebook changes. The entry for the evening of September 20th begins normally. Margaret had completed her afternoon transect and returned to camp. She notes the temperature, 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind direction, which had shifted from the northwest to out of the east, which she notes as unusual for that drainage in autumn. She had made her dinner, written up her transect data, and was sitting outside the tent at approximately 8:15 in the evening. Here is what she wrote, and I am going to paraphrase because these are her words and hers to keep, but the substance is exact. The horses, she had a small group of ungulates at the edge of her observation range, 3 elk cows and a spike bull she had been tracking for 2 days, had been moving along the bench above her camp when they stopped. All 4 animals. Simultaneously, not the gradual slowing of animals interrupted at their feeding, but the sudden absolute stillness of prey in the presence of a predator. She had seen elk behave this way around wolves before. She noted it, looked for the wolf, did not find one, looked back at the elk. The elk were not looking downwind or uphill, where a wolf in that terrain would logically be. They were looking across the drainage, at the opposite bank. Margaret writes that she followed their gaze. She describes the bank as approximately 40 yards away, a steep cut section of the creek bank with a fringe of willows at the water, and then lodgepole coming up immediately behind. Thick cover. Normal cover. The kind of cover you look at on a trail and see nothing, because there is always nothing there. There was something there. She writes, at first I processed it as a bear standing upright on the bank to get a scent read. Large black bear on its hind legs is what my brain said first. Then it moved, and I understood that was wrong. What she describes next took me 3 readings before I could hold it steadily. The height, she estimated it at 8 to 9 feet, with the qualifier that it was standing on the cut bank, which may have added apparent height, but even accounting for that, the scale was wrong for any bear she had ever seen. The posture was not a bear rearing on hind legs. The shoulders, she uses the word architecture. The shoulder architecture was not ursine. Too broad, too structured. The upper body too disproportionately massive relative to the lower. The head was wrong. She writes the head was elongated in a way inconsistent with bear morphology. The ears were pointed and set high. The face, what I could see of it, was canine rather than ursine. Elongated snout. Jaw visible and heavy. She was 40 yards away. She had a good headlamp but did not turn it on. She did not move. The creature, she uses the word creature, was standing on the opposite bank looking at her camp, not moving, just present. She noted that its eyes caught available moonlight in the manner of a tapetum lucidum reflection, the amber eye shine of a large predatory animal. She writes that the intelligence in its regard was the thing that prevented her from moving, which is a very precise way of saying what she means. It was not looking at her camp the way an animal looks at a food source. It was looking at it the way something looks at something it is assessing. She sat still for what she estimates was 4 to 6 minutes. Then it turned and moved into the lodgepole bank behind it, and she describes the movement as fluid and bipedal and absolutely silent for its size, and then it was gone. The elk held their position for another full minute after it left. Then the spike bull put his head down and resumed feeding. Margaret writes, "I am a wildlife biologist. I have an obligation to describe what I observe without interpretation that exceeds the data. What I observed does not fit any species in my training. I am describing it as accurately as I can, and I am aware of how it reads. I am also aware that I am alone in this drainage for 3 more days, and I need to think clearly." That sentence alone tells you what kind of woman she is. She did not break camp that night. She assessed the situation with the same professional framework she would apply to any field observation, made a determination that the animal, she still used the word animal at this point in the notebook, had shown no threatening behavior, and went to sleep. She notes that she placed her bear spray inside the tent with her rather than, in its usual position, clipped to the tent door zipper. Small adjustment, appropriate adjustment. I have guided 25 years in that range, and I would have done exactly the same thing. September 21st, she conducted her morning transect and found nothing anomalous. The ungulate sign was normal. The creek was running at expected levels. She notes in her morning entry that she slept adequately and that daylight recalibrates things, which is true, and which is something anyone who has spent serious time alone in wilderness knows. The night can make a thing larger than it is. Morning is an editor. She completed her afternoon transect and returned to camp at approximately 5:30. At 7:45, still full light in late September, she saw it again. This time, it was not on the opposite bank. It was on her side of the creek, in the lodgepole above and behind her camp, upslope by perhaps 60 yards. She saw it because a raven, she had noted a pair of ravens working the drainage since her arrival, exploded out of the trees above in the specific way ravens leave trees when something large moves beneath them. She looked up. It was standing in the trees, partially screened by the lodgepole trunks, and it was looking directly at her. She writes, "It was between me and the uphill exit from this drainage." I note this as a positional fact, not necessarily a behavioral one. I do not know if position was intentional. That qualification, the precision of noting the observation without overclaiming the interpretation, is Margaret Ellison's voice throughout the notebook. She never tells you what it means. She tells you what she saw, and she is rigorous about where the data ends and the inference begins. I find this more credible than any number of first-person encounter accounts I have read over the years. People who invent things do not work that hard at their own limitations. She stood still. It stood still. After a period she estimates at 2 to 3 minutes, it moved slowly, up slope and out of her sight line. She made a decision that evening that I think about every time I read this section. She did not call her check-in. Not because she had forgotten, she explicitly notes the check-in time in the margin of the entry and then crosses it out. She writes, "If I report an unidentified bipedal hominid at close range in a federal wilderness area, this survey ends. I am not ready to end it." That decision cost her 3 days of being reported missing and an organized search. I am not judging it. I understand it completely. The third night, September 22nd, the night she was already overdue according to her check-in schedule, is where the notebook becomes something different. It came back after dark. She had stayed awake, and she writes without apology that she stayed awake intentionally. She wanted to see if it would come, and she wanted to observe what it did if it did. The satellite communicator was within reach. The bear spray was in her hand. She was not passive. She was watching. It came to the edge of the camp's perimeter. Closer than either previous sighting, she estimates 25 to 30 yards. It came slowly, and she describes the approach as deliberate and calibrated in a way that specific word, calibrated, appears twice in a single paragraph, which tells you it struck her as noteworthy enough to repeat. It stood at the edge of the firelight. She had kept the fire small and low, which was a practical decision. She notes the wind had come back up, and she did not want to broadcast her position, but which meant the light was enough to see by without being blinding to her own night vision. She writes that at 25 yards, in that firelight, she could see the face clearly. She describes the face. I am going to read you her description as closely as I can render it in paraphrase, because this section of the notebook is the section Harlan Pope told me he read 4 times before he could make himself believe a trained scientist had written it. The snout, elongated, canine, but the jaw wider and heavier than any canine she had seen, with the suggestion of significant dentition she did not attempt to fully observe. The ears, erect, pointed, positioned at the apex of the skull the way a large dog's ears are positioned, but larger in proportion. The brow, she describes a pronounced brow ridge, heavier than a human's but not the flat brow of a bear. And the eyes. She writes about the eyes in a way she does not write about anything else in 17 pages. She writes, the eyes contained, and I am using this word with full awareness of its anthropomorphic implications. The eyes contained what I can only describe as active evaluation. I have observed predators at this range before. The regard of a mountain lion at close range, of a grizzly at close range, has a quality of assessing me as a food or threat variable. This was not that. This was something looking at me the way, and I understand how this reads, the way one person looks at another person they are trying to understand. She sat with that for 3 more hours without moving. 3 things she notes about its communication during those 3 hours that she returns to repeatedly in the entries that follow, because she was a scientist, and she understood that patterns in observation matter more than single data points. First, it changed position 4 times during the 3 hours, each time moving to a different angle around the camp's perimeter, north edge, east edge, south edge, back to north. And each time before moving, it held still in a way she described as distinct from ambient stillness, a held quality. Like a pause before a sentence, she writes. She understood this, after the 3rd movement, as announcement rather than stealth. It was telling her before it moved. Whether that was for her benefit or its own, she writes, she cannot determine. Second, twice during those 3 hours it made a sound. She describes it as low, below the register she would call a vocalization, more a resonance felt than heard, and it lasted 4 to 5 seconds both times. Both times it occurred when she moved, once when she shifted her weight, once when she reached slowly for her water bottle. She writes, I do not want to overinterpret this, but the correlation is strong enough to note. The sound appears to occur in response to my movement. I do not know if this is alarm, attention, or something else. I am noting it. Third, at approximately 11:30, something happened in the trees on the far side of camp. She thinks it was a branch dropping, the kind of settling sound old timber makes on cold nights, and she startled visibly, turned toward the sound. When she turned back, it had moved forward by approximately 5 yards, not retreated. Forward. She writes, I believe it moved toward me when I appeared alarmed. I recognize this is a claim I cannot fully support. I am noting the sequence of events and the apparent directionality. She understood, across those 3 hours, that this was communication. Not human communication, not language, but structured, intentional exchange between 2 entities who were both paying close attention. She was not prey in this encounter. She writes that explicitly, and she knows it reads as wishful thinking, and she includes the observational support anyway. The approach was never from downwind. She was never flanked or enclosed. The departure at 2 in the morning was in full view and deliberately slow. She was being visited, not hunted. The attack, because there was an attack, and the title of this story is not wrong. came the following day, and it was not what you are imagining. Here is where I need to be precise, because the word attack can mean many things, and what happened on that trail on the afternoon of September 22nd needs to be understood in its correct context. Margaret broke camp that morning, not because she was fleeing, she is explicit about this, but because her survey of that particular campsite was complete, and she had planned to move to a secondary location farther up the drainage that day regardless. Standard field protocol. She writes in the morning entry that she had slept 4 hours, that she felt alert, that the previous night's observation had not destabilized her, and that she intended to continue her survey. She broke camp by 9:30. She was on the trail by 10. The trail to the secondary site climbs for about a mile before crossing the North Fork at a log bridge and ascending the opposite bank into the upper bench country. She had made this crossing twice in previous surveys. She knew the trail. She had been walking for approximately 40 minutes when she became aware that she was not alone on it. The way she describes this awareness is not dramatic. It arrives in the notebook as a series of small observations. The birds in the canopy went silent over a span of about 30 seconds, sequentially from north to south as if something was moving through them. The creak noise, which had been consistent, dropped. She took a moment to work out why, and concluded she had moved into a section where the bank curved away from the trail, and the acoustic coverage changed, and the trail ahead, where it turned sharply right around a bluff of exposed rock, had a quality she describes with a single word, occupied. She stopped. She stood still on the trail for what she estimates was 60 to 90 seconds, looking at the rock face ahead and the trail curve beyond it. Nothing was visible. Nothing moved. She writes, "My professional assessment is that I should turn around. I am going to continue." I have read that line more times than any other line in 17 pages. I recognize it because I have written its equivalent in my own field notebooks. It is what people who work alone in the backcountry write when they know they are making the wrong choice, and they are going to make it anyway, because turning back has costs that forward momentum does not. She continued. It was waiting around the corner of that rock face, at what she later estimated as 10 to 12 feet, standing in the center of the trail, motionless. She writes that she stopped immediately and that her first clear thought was, "It followed me." Her second thought, which she notes with a dry precision I find entirely characteristic of her, of course it did. What happened next took perhaps 45 seconds, and she describes it with the same meticulous objectivity she brought to everything else in those 17 pages. It did not charge her. It did not vocalize. It stood in the trail, and it held still, and she understood, she writes, that the word that came to her was blockade. She understood she was being prevented from continuing up that trail. She took 2 steps forward, testing. It leaned. She writes, "It did not step toward me. It shifted its weight forward, and the shift was sufficient. The shift was sufficient." 4 words. I want you to sit with those 4 words for a moment, because they tell you everything about the scale of what she was standing 10 feet from. A shift of weight that constitutes a communication. A shift of weight that stops a person. She stopped. She stood there. It stood there. And then it did something that she writes about for half a page, and that Harland Pope, when he read this section, put the photocopy down and walked to the window and stood there for a while. It turned. Slowly. Not away from her, not departing. Turned to face the slope above the trail, uphill, into the dense timber of the upper drainage. It held that position, facing uphill, presenting its profile to her for approximately 10 seconds. Then it looked back at her, then back uphill, then at her again. She writes, "It was showing me something." I am aware that this is the single most difficult interpretive claim in everything I have written in these pages, and I am making it anyway because I observed the behavior 3 times in sequence, and the directionality was unambiguous. It was directing my attention uphill. She looked uphill. She did not see anything immediately. Then she saw the shape, farther up the slope, partially behind a downed log, at a distance she estimates at 120 yards. Another one. Stationary, watching the trail. She writes there are 2 of them. Here is what the next 2 days of the notebook contain because Margaret Ellison did not immediately walk out. She was unable to walk out. The fractured arm came on the first evening after the encounter on the trail, when she missed a step on the creek crossing in failing light. A simple and stupid accident that had nothing to do with the creatures, and everything to do with a person who was managing a great deal of cognitive load at the end of a very long day and put her foot wrong. She heard the radius crack. She has described this in the account she gave Search and Rescue as the whole of the incident, and I am not going to contradict that account in any identifying way. What the notebook describes across those 2 additional days is this. She made a camp where she treated the arm as best she could with her first aid kit, and she watched and she wrote. The injured camp was roughly 150 yards from where the trail encounter had happened, in a small flat section between the creek and the base of the slope. She had chosen it for practical reasons: flat ground, access to water, visible sky for the satellite communicator when she was ready to use it. She was not ready to use it yet, and she writes honestly about why she was still a researcher. The data from the previous 3 nights was unlike anything she had ever gathered, and she was rational enough, even on a broken arm, to understand that leaving immediately would mean leaving the observation window. She writes, "The arm is manageable. The ibuprofen is doing what ibuprofen does. I can write, I can observe, I can make this decision tomorrow." She made that decision twice, and then she walked out. The nights of the injured camp are the most detailed entries in the notebook. She had nothing to do but observe and record, and she did both with everything she had. Night 1 of the injured camp, one of them, the original one, she had begun noting them as individual A and individual B in her records, which is standard wildlife biology protocol, and which I find quietly characteristic of her. Individual A came at approximately 8:45 in the evening, earlier than any previous night. She speculates on this timing and then crosses out the speculation, which you can see in the photocopy, and simply records the fact. It came at 8:45. Distance, she estimates 50 yards, farther back than it had been on any previous approach. It came to that position and it held there. She writes about the light conditions. There was cloud cover and no moon, and her headlamp was at quarter power to conserve the battery. She could see its outline, the amber eyeshine in the headlamp beam, the stillness. It stayed until approximately 11:30. Present from 8:45 to 11:30. Nearly 3 hours. During those 3 hours, she moved twice to reposition her arm, which she had splinted with equipment from her first aid kit, and was managing with a combination of ibuprofen and the specific kind of focused attention a person develops when the alternative is panic. Both times she moved, and this is the entry I have read more times than any other in the notebook. Both times she repositioned herself. It made the low resonance vocalization, not the interrogative register she had noted on the second night. The lower sustained one. 4 to 5 seconds. Twice. She writes, "The vocalization is correlated with my pain adjustments. I have now observed this 4 times. The correlation is strong enough that I am comfortable calling it non-random. I do not know what the vocalization means. I know it is not alarm. The post-vocalization behavior does not change. The animal does not retreat or advance. I am noting it because I am a scientist, and this is what scientists do with data they cannot yet explain. That is what scientists do with data they cannot yet explain. She wrote it on a broken arm in the dark in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and it is the most quietly determined sentence I have ever read in a field notebook. Night 2 of the injured camp, both of them. Individual A at approximately 60 yards. Individual B farther back. She could not get a precise distance on individual B. The cover was too heavy, but present. Both still. Both holding. She writes, "They are not advancing. I do not understand why this matters to me as much as it does, but I find myself recording it with relief." That one sentence is the closest Margaret Ellison comes to personal disclosure in 17 pages. She records the relief. She does not explain it. She does not need to. Anyone who has been alone with something large and unknown in the dark, and felt the particular relief of it not coming closer, understands exactly what she means. On the morning of the third day, she made the decision to walk out. She cached her research equipment and her tent, kept only what she needed for a single-day exit, and walked out on a broken arm over 7 miles of rough trail in 8 hours. She did not see either of them on the way out. The notebook was found not at her camp. She had it with her, but near the trailhead, dropped when she was spotted by the 1st Search and Rescue Unit and put her pack down. When they asked her what had happened, she said she had fallen at the creek crossing and lost her camp orientation for 2 days. That is the official account. That is what the official record says. The 17 pages say something else entirely. I have been a wilderness guide for 25 years, and I have read field notes, incident reports, search and rescue logs, and game warden observations for most of that time. I know what skilled professional observation looks like in written form. Margaret Ellison's notebook is among the most careful and credible first-hand accounts of anything I have ever encountered in a written document. I want to tell you what the notes establish, because they establish several things that matter, and that I do not believe have been said plainly anywhere in any account of this type of encounter. The first thing they establish is that these are not solitary animals. The presence of a second individual, farther up the slope, watching the trail, that is sentinel behavior. That is organized behavior. One animal stops the approach on the trail. One animal holds an elevated observation position. They have roles. That is not instinct the way a bear's food drive is instinct. That is coordination with purpose. Dale Ostrowski, when I read him this section over the phone, was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "So they work together." Yes, that is what the notes indicate. They work together. They have, to use a word carefully and deliberately, a strategy. The second thing they establish is that the blockade on the trail had a purpose beyond territorial defense. Margaret looked uphill because it directed her to. She saw the second individual because it showed her where to look. She was not being threatened away from her route. She was being redirected. She was being given information about what was above her on that slope. And the question I have turned over for 5 years, the question I have never arrived at a satisfying answer to is, redirected from what? What was in that upper drainage in September of 2019 that required 2 of these animals to deploy a behavioral protocol sophisticated enough to include information transferred to a human observer? A denning location. Young animals, maybe? Something they were protecting with the specific approach of showing rather than threatening, because threatening might have produced panic and flight toward the thing they needed her away from, while showing her produced a conscious choice to turn back. I have walked that upper bench twice since 2019. Found a section of blowdown on the upper bench that shows a pattern of disturbance I cannot account for with wind or elk. Logs moved in ways that blown timber does not move. Ground debris cleared in an area roughly 15 by 20 feet. It could be anything. I note it because my job, the way I understand my job in relation to these notes, is to note things and let them be what they are, until the evidence says something more definitive. The third thing the notes establish, and this is the one that keeps me sitting on this porch at night 5 years later, is the behavior during her 2 days of injury. The recession of the approach distance, the vocalization correlated with her pain adjustments, the holding back, the stillness of individual B at the edge of the camp's perimeter. None of this is the behavioral profile of a predator managing a compromised prey animal. A predator given the opportunity to take an injured, isolated human at altitude in late September does not hold back. It does not stay farther back than on previous nights. It does not produce vocalizations that correlate with the prey animal's discomfort. Something operating on a more complex goal structure than predation might do all of those things. She survived 3 days alone in that drainage with a broken arm and 2 of these animals occupying the terrain around her. She walked out on her own. She sat in a hospital in Hamilton, Montana for 2 days while they set her arm, and she answered all the questions about a fall, and then she drove home, and she went back to work. The notebook went with her. Then Harlan Pope's photocopy came to me. I would not be telling this story if it were only Margaret Ellison's. I would be telling you about her notebook, which is significant enough on its own terms. But I have to be honest with you about the other reason I have sat with these notes for 5 years, and the reason I understand what she described well enough to speak about it with some confidence. 6 months after Harlan Pope gave me those photocopies, I started noticing something at the northwest corner of my property. My land runs up against National Forest boundary at the back corner. The drainage that runs along my fence line connects, through the watershed system, to the same North Fork drainage Margaret was surveying. Different entry point, same hydrological system. The same water that moves past her research site moves, some miles downstream and several elevation changes later, along the edge of what I have always thought of as my country. The first sign was the larch at the corner post, 3 parallel gouges in the bark at a height I could not reach on a ladder without stretching. White wood showing. Fresh cuts. I photographed them in early December of 2019, and I have the photograph still. I showed it to Dale, and he looked at it for a long time, and he did not say what made it. February 14th, 2020, I saw it for the first time. Standing at the northwest fence corner at a distance I estimated at 80 yards, roughly 8.5 feet. Dark fur near black. The canine head, the amber eye shine catching the barn light from the property. Standing upright, still, watching my porch. I am not going to give you the full account of the 5 years that followed tonight. That is a separate story, and it deserves its own telling with the time and attention it requires. What I will tell you, because it is directly relevant to this story and to what Margaret Ellison wrote, is this: what came to my fence line matched her description in every physical particular. Height, fur color, the canine head with the pointed ears positioned high on the skull, the amber eye shine, the hands, and I saw the hands clearly on multiple occasions, at distances that did not leave room for ambiguity, hands with functional fingers, not paws. The same fluid, upright, silent gait she had described on that creek bank at 40 yards. She had seen 1, then 2, in a remote wilderness drainage accessible only by a multi-day approach on foot. 1 found me at my property line in Ravalli County, 6 miles from a state highway, 42 acres from the National Forest boundary. They are not only in the deep wilderness. That is one of the things Margaret Ellison's notebook tells you if you know where to look in it. Her 2 individuals were coordinated and purposeful, and operating in terrain that sees human activity. She was not a casual presence. She was a professional researcher making regular transects, and they navigated that presence with a sophistication that implies they had been doing so for some time. What came to my fence line was doing the same thing, observing, assessing. conducting what I can only call a patient, extended examination of a human being in his native territory. It came to my fence line for 5 years, then it stopped. I do not know why it stopped, and I am not going to claim I do. What I know is that across 5 years of nightly observation from distances that eventually closed to less than 15 feet, what I saw matched Margaret Ellison's field description so precisely that the only sensible conclusion is that she and I were observing the same species, same morphology, same behavioral patterns, same quality of regard. 2 independent observers, no contact between us, same mountain system, same descriptions. I believed her before I had any personal reason to. After 5 years of my own observations, I believe her in a way that goes past the word believe. I know what she saw. 5 years of sitting with 17 pages leaves you with a particular relationship to unanswerable questions. I have made my peace with most of them. Some I have not. The redirection on the trail. Whatever was in that upper drainage on September 22, 2019, that required a traveling researcher to be stopped and shown an alternative direction. I have my guesses. A denning site. Young animals. Something that required the protection of behavioral rather than physical intervention, because a physical threat display would have produced panic and possibly flight toward, while an informational redirect produced a conscious choice to turn back. The distinction between those 2 approaches implies a working model of how a human will respond to a given stimulus. That implies a model of another mind. That is a significant thing to say about an animal that most people believe does not exist. I have walked that upper bench twice since 2019, found a section of disturbed blowdown that I cannot account for with wind or elk. Logs moved in ways blown timber does not move. Ground debris cleared in a rough oval, 15 by 20 feet. It could be anything. I note it because noting things accurately is the only tool I have. The second open question, the 2 days of modified approach during her injury. Whatever calculation produced that recession, whatever assessment of her compromised state led to held distance rather than advance, that calculation required information about human vulnerability and a decision about what to do with that information across 2 nights of maintained behavior. Not a single choice. Sustained. I do not know what framework produces that. I know the framework exists. The third question, and the one I think about on the nights when I cannot sleep, what did Margaret Ellison's notebook cost her? She is a working wildlife biologist. Her credibility is her career. She made the choice to say she fell, to keep the 17 pages private, to return to the field as if that drainage were ordinary country. What does it cost a scientist to carry that kind of knowledge in a field that has no framework for receiving it? To go back out on solo survey assignments knowing what she knows about what solo in that terrain actually means? I have never asked her directly. We have spoken once, briefly, through Harlan Pope as intermediary. She confirmed the notebook was accurate. She confirmed her preference for privacy. I honor it completely. But I think about it. She wrote 17 pages of careful, precise observation under conditions that would have sent most people straight to their satellite communicator and out of that drainage as fast as their legs would carry them. She maintained her scientific protocols across 3 days of genuine physical and psychological duress. She produced a document that is, as best I can determine, the most detailed first-hand account of extended behavioral observation of this type of animal in a natural setting that exists anywhere in any form. That deserves to be said out loud. So, I am saying it. I apply the same analytical rigor to this that Margaret applied to her field observations. There are 4 explanations, and I owe each of them honest treatment. First, misidentification, the most parsimonious scientific position. A bear, an unusual human, a combination of isolation stress and unusual wildlife behavior producing a perception that exceeded what was actually there. I give this weight. I give it less weight than I once would have given it, for reasons that include Margaret Ellison's professional training, her explicit note that she had considered and rejected the bear hypothesis for specific morphological reasons, and the corroborating description in my own 5 years of observation. But I do not dismiss it. It exists. Second, an unknown primate species operating in the northern Rockies at population densities low enough to explain both their elusiveness and their apparent intelligence. A relict hominid population that has been in this terrain long enough to develop behavioral sophistication around human presence. This is the hypothesis that fits the behavioral evidence most cleanly, but requires the largest expansion of what we think we know about what lives in North America. Third, something that does not fit the categories we currently use. I am not going to dress this up in scientific language because I do not have scientific language adequate for it. Some things in 40 years of wilderness work have not resolved into any framework I have. This may be one of them. Fourth, my own willingness to believe, after 5 years of personal encounters, may have caused me to read Margaret Ellison's notebook with insufficient skepticism. This is a real risk. I note it. I try to account for it. I do not know how successfully. I do not know. That is the honest answer. I do not know. Here is what I know. I know Margaret Ellison wrote 17 pages of field observations in a Write in the Rain notebook across 3 days alone in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness with a broken arm. And those 17 pages describe physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and communicative behaviors that match, in every detail I can cross-reference, what I observed over 5 years at my own fence line 15 miles south of her research site. 2 independent observers. No contact between us. Same range, same description. I know what that kind of convergence means in terms of evidentiary value. I know that what stopped her on that trail was not random animal aggression. The behavioral sequence, blockade, held position, redirected attention, secondary animal revealed, is not consistent with any territorial or predatory behavior pattern in the literature on North American wildlife. It is consistent with the behavior of something operating on a more complex goal structure than territory or food. I know that she survived 3 days of injury in close proximity to 2 of these animals, and that their behavior during those 3 days was modified in a direction consistent with awareness of her vulnerability, not exploitative. Modified toward, I am going to use the word and acknowledge it is a significant one, modified toward accommodation. I know. That is what I have. I know it. I cannot prove it in any form that would satisfy a peer-reviewed journal. I have cross-referenced observations from 2 independent sources. I have 5 years of personal encounter data, and I have the testimony of a woman who has more professional reason to stay quiet than any person I have ever heard of staying quiet. And yet she wrote it down. She wrote it down carefully and precisely, and in the correct scientific register, and then she walked 7 miles out on a broken arm and chose to keep it private. The choice to keep a true thing private does not make the true thing less true. It makes the person who keeps it more credible, not less. Margaret Ellison had every incentive to never speak of what she saw. She wrote it down anyway because she is a scientist, and scientists observe and record. The notebook exists. The observations are in it. I have read them enough times to have them in memory. Margaret Ellison survived. She survived because of what she did and because of what they allowed. I have thought about the word allowed for 5 years. I am still thinking about it. If you are planning to go into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and it is extraordinary country, I am not telling you not to go. I have given the better part of my adult life to that terrain, and I would not trade a day of it. I want to say something that is not a conventional warning. The animals that live in that wilderness have been there longer than the trail system, longer than the Magruder Road, longer than the town of Darby, or the state of Montana, or any human category applied to that land. What moves in those drainages has adapted to human presence across a time scale we do not have records for. The behavioral intelligence Margaret Ellison observed, the coordination between individuals, the calibrated approach and recession, the information transfer on that trail, the modified behavior during her injury does not develop in a generation. That kind of sophistication across a population develops across a long relationship with the human animal, most of it predating anything we have written down. What she encountered was not a random predator. It was something that had a protocol for her, a way of handling a lone researcher who had walked into a section of that drainage that required management. The protocol involved showing her that there were two of them. The protocol involved directing her attention to the upper slope. The protocol involved, over the 2 days of her injury, something I am going to call restraint, because I do not have a better word, and I am not interested in dressing up straightforward observations in language they do not need. If you go into that country, if you go into any of that mountain system, go with the understanding that being observed is not the same as being threatened. Margaret Ellison's first sound instinct was the right one. Sit still. Do not advance. Let the encounter develop at its own pace. The moment she stopped being a person trying to categorize what was happening and started being a scientist paying very close attention to what she saw, she was operating effectively. Not because attention makes you formidable, because attention communicates something. To whatever was on that bank, a person who sits still and watches is a different category of entity than a person who runs or panics or reaches for something. Pay attention. Stop when the birds stop. Read the trees before the trail curves. And if you are in that section of the upper bench country on a September evening, and the elk freeze and look across the drainage, look where they are looking. Do not move quickly. Do not reach for anything. Just look. You may see something that changes what you think you understand about what that wilderness contains. Thank you is what I want to say, finally, to Margaret Ellison, who will likely never see this, who has her own reasons for the choices she has made, who wrote 17 pages of careful and honest observation in 31-degree temperatures with a fractured arm, and then walked 7 miles out and sat in a hospital room and said, "I fell." What she put into that notebook cost her something. What those notes gave to me, and to anyone who might eventually receive them, is irreplaceable. She survived, she observed, she wrote it down. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The cardiac event clarified things. That is not a figure of speech. There is a specific quality of attention that becomes available when the ordinary horizon of expectation gets interrupted, and in that attention I looked at what I had been holding and made a decision. 5 years is long enough. The story belongs somewhere other than a file in a desk. Margaret Ellison's notebook deserves to exist somewhere beyond a locked drawer in a retired wilderness guide's house in Ravalli County. She put that record into the world, inadvertently, in that her notebook was found before she reached the trailhead, and then the world did nothing with it. The search and rescue report says, hiker, fall, fractured radius, self-rescue, no further action required. There is no mention of 17 pages of field observations. There is no mention of 2 individuals coordinating on a trail in the upper Selway drainage in late September of 2019. There is no mention of the blockade behavior, the redirected attention, the 3 hours of structured proximity on night 2, or the vocalization patterns that correlated with an injured researcher's pain adjustments across 2 nights of observation. That information belongs somewhere. I am putting it here. What I hope for in telling this is not belief, exactly. I know how this sounds. I know that people who have not spent 40 years reading terrain and animal behavior in country like this do not have the same calibration for what constitutes credible testimony in the backcountry, and I know that Dogman as a category comes loaded with associations that make serious consideration difficult for a lot of people. What I hope for is that the specific details of this specific case reach people who are paying attention to this phenomenon with actual rigor, researchers, serious investigators, people who are building a body of evidence over time, and that Margaret Ellison's observations become part of that body. She deserves to have her observations counted. 17 pages, clear hand, steady observation across 3 days of genuine physical duress, produced by a professional who understood what she was recording and why it mattered. That is the record. It is a good record. It should be in the conversation. Most Dogman stories in this genre are organized around fear. The creature as threat, the narrator as survivor, the tension of how close it came and how narrowly the encounter resolved. I understand why those stories dominate, and I do not dismiss the encounters behind them. But what Margaret Ellison experienced in that drainage was not primarily a threat encounter. It was a managed encounter. It was something with a protocol redirecting a lone human researcher, monitoring her injury, and ultimately permitting her to leave. The distinction between a threat and a managed encounter is not trivial. It is, in fact, the most important thing I can say in 10,000 words about what these animals are. They let her walk out. After 3 days, on a broken arm, they let her walk out. That is what this story is. That is what the title means. That is what 17 pages written by a wildlife biologist in a write-in-the-rain notebook on a September mountainside in Montana add up to when you read them carefully enough. That is the story. I hope I have told it right. My name is Robert Bowman, 64 years old, former Marine, retired wilderness guide, 25 years in the Bitterroot Range, witness to 5 years of my own encounters in this same mountain system. Margaret Ellison gave that drainage everything she had as an observer, and she wrote it down in a yellow-covered write-in-the-rain notebook in 31-degree temperatures with a wind out of the east, and, later, on a fractured arm in a camp she did not plan to make. What she described was real. What found her on that trail was real. The 3 days she spent in its proximity are the most significant 3 days of wildlife observation I have ever read an account of, and I have read a great many accounts. The notes exist. I know where they are. I know they are accurate because I spent 5 years observing what she described, and the convergence is exact. If the right researcher comes along, someone doing actual systematic field work, building an actual body of evidence with the rigor that body of evidence requires, those notes should be part of the record. I believe that. I have believed it since November of 2019, and I am saying it out loud for the first time. Somewhere in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, in the high benches of a drainage I have walked 50 times over 30 years, 2 of these animals are still moving through country that has been theirs longer than any map we have drawn of it. Still coordinating. Still holding observation positions above the trail. Still, possibly, stopping lone hikers who wander into sections of the upper bench that are not for wandering into. Operating on a logic that we are, at best, at the beginning of comprehending. Margaret Ellison walked out. She walked 7 miles on a broken arm, and she chose her silence and she went back to her work. I understand why she made that choice, and I am not criticizing it. Some things are too large to explain and too costly to defend, and the decision to keep them private is a reasonable one. I have made a different decision. This is it. If this story reached something in you, if there's a part of what Margaret Ellison wrote, or what I've described from my own years in that drainage, that rings true to something you've seen or heard or can't explain, this channel is where those stories live. Subscribe if you're new. If you've been here a while, you know what this costs to say out loud, and thank you for being the reason it gets said. Stay safe out there. The woods are older than we are.